Hi, welcome back to The Current. This is Chris Nafis, and today I'm very honored to have Isaac Villegas come and join me on the show. He is a ordained pastor in the Mennonite Church USA, served at Chapel Hill Mennonite for a number of years, and currently on break to finish up his PhD at Duke. He wrote a book that's coming out right about now called Migrant God, a Christian Vision for Immigrant Justice. It's very good. He writes for the Christian Century and just a very thoughtful, faithful guy that has lived out the faith in ways that I find really inspiring. We talk about some of those in today's episode. Hope that you'll enjoy it. And here it is. All right. Well, Isaac, I'm really grateful that you said yes to come on here. Thank you so much for giving us a little bit of your time and your wisdom and your expertise. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I'm excited for this.
I feel like we've known each other sort of for like a long time. Like we run into some of the same circles, both kind of around Duke and Durham. And you just like the people that I know that you also know are like amazing people. And so it's just been good to be in touch over the years. Love your writing. Just really appreciate you.
That's very kind. Thank you. Very kind of you.
Yeah, you got a book coming out that I got some advanced access to. I was really excited to read it. I read it in like just a few days. It's called Migrant God, a Christian Vision for Immigrant Justice. And I mean, the book is sort of about migration and migration justice and immigration justice. It's sort of it's about showing up on behalf of people who are migrants, right? It's kind of this blend. And you yourself grew up like child of immigrants and kind of in this world and obviously like faithful pastor in the church. Like what did you learn researching and writing the book? Like what was there for you in this? I don't know if that's a good
that is so true. Like I would say, in terms of what motivated me and like, well, I should say for myself, it's hard to write. Like I am not a natural writer. It's just something that I have to do. Like it's very hard. Like writing, I mean, you finish the book in a few days because it's pretty short.
Yeah.
It's a like glorified pamphlet, let's say. But it started off longer, and the more I read it, the more I like chopped stuff down because I get really frustrated with being verbose and I don't know. But like what ends up happening is I start writing and I get drawn into the story and like I start remembering stuff. And so you're right. Like I revisited my part of my life, part of growing up, things that I just don't remember. For example, as I was writing about the way that Border Patrol surveils brown people in the Southwest, let's say California, Arizona, that's where I grew up. I remember, like, as I was thinking about writing about other people, I remembered, like, all of a sudden, a memory flashed into my mind of when I was like around six or seven. Well, yeah, around 6 or 7, where we would drive back and forth from Los Angeles to Arizona, visiting family, all that kind of stuff. Is that I-8? I think it's I-8 down there, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. I-8. And I remembered, all of a sudden, when we got stopped at one of these checkpoints. It was right there by the border between California and Arizona. And like I was just drawn into the moment, and I'd not really thought about it before, but it was a moment where they pulled us over, and they took my dad, and I remember they took my dad into like custody in their little outpost thing, and they had the drug dogs like come around and like sniff through our car and our bags and all this. And it was this moment I'm just like, whoa, I guess that's a repressed memory. And so I called my dad, and I'm just like, I'm not making this up, right? This happened. He's like, oh my gosh, yes, that happened. And we had never talked about it. Like, it was just one of these things that happened in the past. And like, it's kind of embarrassing, I guess, too. I don't know, but yeah. So some of these stories, as I'm telling stories about other people in the book, as I get drawn in, all of a sudden, like things start coming back to me about my own life that I remembered and had to sort through all over again, I guess.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's one example of like learning about myself, I guess, through writing the book.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing how some of those memories come back when you start just like reflecting on it. And I mean, that's such like an intense experience. You know, Rich and I've been, or our family's been going down to Baja a bunch the last several years, and there's all these checkpoints down there. And last time we were down there, we got stopped, and like a guy with like a big gun like was crawling through our car and stuff. And you just don't think about how, especially I feel like for people who are probably most people who are white and who just aren't really worried about those border checkpoints, because I know the exact checkpoint you're talking about. Probably we pass through it every time we go out to the East County. You know, we just don't really think much of it. But if you are someone who you feel like, even if you don't know you're not, you don't have anything, you're not smuggling anything, it's still just like such an scary, like people experience the world in such different ways, I guess what I'm trying to get at, because of their immigration status, because of, you know, race and ethnicity and language. Maybe I should ask you to start like, so you grew up like in LA area and then moved to Arizona. Like where are you from? What do you do?
Yeah.
Maybe tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. I grew up. So my dad migrated from Colombia, and then my mom from Costa Rica, and they met in Los Angeles, Redondo Beach, and that's where they started a family. So my sister and we grew up there. My dad, for his whole work life, my dad worked in the same factory, which is amazing. So it was a factory in Carson. We lived in Lomita. For those Californians out there who know these places, I'm in North Carolina now, so
San Diego, so we know some LA places.
So,
yeah.
And then my mom has been a beautician for all of her time in for her work life. Cuts hair. Anyhow, so we grew up there in Lomita, Carson, Torrance area. Dad worked in this factory, and so then they basically opened another factory in Tucson, Arizona, and we moved with the factory. My dad was sent to Tucson. So I grew up in Los Angeles and then in Tucson. Grew up Catholic at the beginning, Latin American. That was kind of just what happens, I guess. Maybe I don't know if that's true anymore, but that's what it was like back then. And then, but my parents, I don't remember how old I was, but I have vague memories of the Catholic Church. And then they became more charismatic. There was a charismatic renewal movement happening within the Catholic Church at the time. And that became more and more interesting to them. And so we started doing, Wednesday night meetings with praise and, guitars, fruits of the manifestations of the spirits. Got drawn into, storefront charismatic churches, vineyard stuff. And that was kind of significant for me growing up. Then, went to college, came out here to North Carolina to go to Duke Divinity School for seminary, and then became a Mennonite pastor out here and have been here ever since.
Nice. Yeah. How'd you end up with the Mennonites?
So I heard about the Mennonites when I was in college. In college, I had a bit of a crisis of faith. It was at the end, I think it was my senior year of college, is when 9/11 happened. And I was shaken in my faith because of all the Christians and, churches that formed me, church I was going to. They were calling for revenge. And I was like, y'all taught me that Jesus was important. And Jesus is especially important in times like this. Jesus doesn't talk about killing people. That is not the way of the gospel. And it just really messed with my head. And I had a professor who was very pastoral. His name is Jonathan Wilson. He's now retired. He's a Canadian Baptist. And he told me the story of the Anabaptists and the 16th century Anabaptist movement, which is a nonviolent Christian movement. And I was like, yes, that's amazing. I want to worship. Where are these communities? And there weren't any around there in that part of California. And so when I moved out here to North Carolina, I just looked up if there were any Mennonite churches. And Mennonites are kind of Anabaptists, part of the Anabaptist tradition, and found one and showed up to church. one time to Chapel and Mennonite Fellowship, and that Sunday, one of the members of the church, Tom Lehman, said to me, "Oh, welcome to church. Would you mind reading scripture the next Sunday?" And so I was like, "Oh, I guess I'm going back to church next Sunday." And then basically they're like, "Oh, you're coming to church. How would you like to serve as our pastor?" And I was like, "Okay, I guess this is the leading of the Spirit."
All right, man. That's I love that. That's such a great story of just getting in. I mean, we do the same thing, right? Like we try to get new people like a chance to read, a chance to participate, and then you belong, and now you're a Mennonite pastor doing PhD work at Duke, and you write for like a bunch of places, right?
Yeah, just let me clarify that I'm no longer the pastor of that church. They now have a wonderful new pastor, and yeah, I had to stepped away from that to do this PhD work, religion, and yeah, right for Christian Century. That's kind of been my home, and for our Mennonite denominational magazine as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I always like your stuff pops up for me on just social media and stuff. And it's so you're like one of those writers where it's like it's always worth the click and the read because you're thoughtful and concise, maybe because you cut down all your writing so much, which is what a good writer does, right? And I don't know, there's just like a genuineness to what you do. And I found
thank you. That's very kind.
Ahead.
Just let me say thank you. That's very kind of you to say. It's one of these things like writing. This is what I miss about preaching, because preaching, you kind of get to, even though you never know what a sermon does, or maybe you do, maybe you notice, but I never knew what a sermon does, what it did. But at least when you're preaching, you get to see like faces and how it's affecting people. And you're like, oh, communication's happening.
Right.
And even somebody afterwards who says like, hey, thanks for your sermon. You know what I mean? Like it's it's kind of like a routine that happens, but it's something. Whereas with writing stuff, it's like, I sent it off. I have no idea if it ever lands anywhere. So it's always nice to find somebody to be like, oh yeah, it resonated with me. So yeah, thanks.
Well, your stuff lands well with me. And that's for sure true about preaching. That was part of what was so hard during COVID was preaching into like a Zoom screen and teaching too. Like, it's just like a black hole, just like sucks the life out of you because you have no feedback, like preaching and usually has, and I'm not a super charismatic preacher. I'm kind of probably a boring preacher, teaching style preacher, but even me, like you see faces and you get energy from the people who are with you. And there's like this back and forth that happens and it's just not there in all forms of communication, including podcasts. And even though like I always tell people like, you'd be shocked how little feedback you get as a preacher. Like people just don't actually tell you anything, but they'll come say nice word today or something, but you just don't get a lot of like detailed feedback, but you get it through the body language and through the eyes and stuff for sure.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, a big part of the book and what has been like, you're one of those people where I'm like, man, there's not a lot of people in the church that are inspiring to me that I want to be like these days, which is kind of sad to say, but you're one of them. And part of the reason is because of what you and your communities have done. Just in like the kinds of actions that you've done. You talk about like the book is really a series of stories about, different kinds of like communal action, I guess. Is that a fair way to
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is the other thing I should say. I'm very Mennonite in this where, there's this Mennonite sensibility where it's an Anabaptist sensibility where, you don't know if the gospel is preached until it's received as good as news. There's no like this sense of this sacramental understanding of preaching, like I preached, therefore it happened. It's more like, well, no, did you receive what I'm saying as good and as news? If not, then we need to talk more about this. So you describing the book in the ways that you are is actually really helpful for me to figure out like what happened. Did
you preach?
Did anything happen in this book?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure a lot of people are going to find that. And I know there's like a pragmatism in that, like, because Mennonites, like, do they all still do this? Like, you kind of sit down and have like a discussion about the sermon afterwards, right? And there's a sense that like this is a word that someone's sharing, very strong on like priesthood of all believers, right? That the pastor kind of has a little bit of a role in the community, but it's not like elevated in a way that in some denominations there's like ordination carries this huge weight and this huge, kind of priestly position. And I appreciate all that about the witness of the Mennonites, and it's really beautiful. And I think that maybe that's part of how you end up with this like really deep sense of communal identity in the church, in the Mennonite church. This is one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because you talk, I think you quoted Hauerwas at some point talking about like kind of ethics and like what the church is. And I think I wrote it down somewhere, but something like the church is not supposed to have a social ethic, but to be a social ethic, right? And so there's like a difference between the church kind of carrying values and ethics and whatever, and like living it and being it. And I think that's like, could you say a little bit about that? Like that's a significant change in mentality, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I was very much affected by Professor Hauerwas, and his line, it's from Peaceable Kingdom. And he says it throughout. I mean, it's kind of one of the important things that he contributes to our conversation about theology and ethics is, the church is not the church doesn't have a social ethic. The church is a social ethic. And what he's trying to name there is that like what we do as a community, as a body, is already political. It's already a statement. How we organize our lives together, who's able to like speak from the pulpit, who's able to read scripture, who do we entrust with proclaiming God's word? All of that is like relationships of power and what we're trying to say as a community. So I think, and part of his point, which I take very seriously, is that like, we don't necessarily have to think about, okay, we do this thing called the gospel at church and shape our lives around it. And now we got to translate that message into the secular world out there that lives by its own logic and its own rules. And he's like, no, the translation, you don't need to translate. You just do the things that are church everywhere. And so maybe one story to like along these lines where I think it's like pretty Hauerwasian is we would do at church. So for Mennonites and other Christian traditions, like during Holy Week, you kick, leading up to Easter, Thursday is a very important day. It's Maundy Thursday or Holy Thursday. Maundy is like Latin for command, I think. Is that right? Sounds like Monday. It's in Spanish. I'm sure it's Latin for command. And so what it remembers is the command of Jesus to the disciples on that last night where he's eating with them before he's taken away, where he says, this command I give to you to love one another. And then he says, you know what? This love is not just something you think about or you just say, you enact it. And that's where he washes the disciples' feet. And you remember Peter being like, no, you can't. Well, you're my rabbi. You can't do that. And Jesus is like, well, if you won't do this, you have no part of me. He's like, okay. So it's kind of this revolutionary act of servanthood that Jesus embodies in foot washing. And so Holy Thursday, for us in our church, we do a foot washing service where we wash another's feet. And this is how we acknowledge that we live by Christ's love for us. And we pour that out with one another as we wash feet. So we just decided to do that at the Immigrant Detention Center one Holy Thursday to be like, hey, look, this was during the Obama era when he, or maybe I don't know, President Obama did a lot of the infrastructural work to set up the U.S. deportation machine that President Trump is now utilizing to the max. And one of the things that Obama did was start setting up these kind of like they were, what did he call? I can't remember what they're called, but basically they're little like little sub unit. They're like sub ICE detention centers in all these suburban areas throughout the United States. And we found one of them, or a journalist found one of them, and it was nearby in Cary, of all places, which is like this kind of a more of an upper class area between Raleigh and Durham, which are the two larger cities, suburban. Anyhow, so we went over there and we just with a bunch of people, this was like an ecumenical, our Catholic worker friends were there, other people from other churches. And we just did a whole worship service there in the parking lot, demanding for us to have access to our brothers and sisters in Christ who they were keeping from us, to say like, look, this service is all about all of us washing each other's feet. It's wrong for you to keep them from us, let them out. And they didn't. And they locked the doors and called the police on us and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, so that's an example. It's just like, look, what we do as a church, our social witness, our ethic is this worship service, which is where we wash each other's feet. This is how we declare that we're the body of Christ. And we're just doing that in a place where it's more politically provocative. Does that make sense as like an example?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's what. So like, I just read your book. Like, I mean, I finished it today, right? So, well, one of the things that's got me thinking about is the way that, like, that and some of the other stories in your like your, because you're telling these stories of your church and other churches that have like done these things, and like, I think what's profound about them is that they're like the actions themselves, the thing that you're doing is so profoundly like rooted in like the worship and practice of the church. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like you're not doing like it's not showy sort of acts of political theater or something like that. Like you're just doing Christian stuff and doing it in a way that's public. And that kind of like has this prophetic effect. And because you're doing it, like you're really doing it, you're not just like pretending to wash someone's feet. Like you're actually in the parking lot washing people's feet. There's like an authenticity to it that kind of can cut through some of just all the, there's just like so much chatter and talk and bluster and everything. But when you actually like just do the thing, I mean, there's something really beautiful about that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And I'm just now remembering, I didn't include this in the book, but so we would do that worship service, the foot washing worship service, like every Maundy Thursday, every year for, I can't remember how many years, and it kind of grew. But I remember this, I mean, he's an amazing person. His name's Patrick, and he's part of that. He's a Catholic worker person around here. And he would, during the service, so the police would show up, especially that first time. They were there in mass and were threatening to arrest us. And Patrick, who believes in the power of the Holy Spirit and the gospel, as I'm trying to like do this service, hold things together because I'm leading it, Patrick goes and starts inviting like a police officer to come have their feet washed. And I was just like, this is. Yeah, I'm like, this is the gospel, right? Like, this is like what it's, I mean, they did not, but it was just like this moment. I'm like, that's super powerful that, yeah, like you're saying, this is about worship. This is about the gospel, and every worship service is always public. That's what that's what we do as church. And we're just doing it in a different place. And if someone's moved by the Holy Spirit, like this police officer, what's to stop them from joining? So I don't know. I just, yeah, that was just a powerful moment. I should have talked about that, but I'd forgotten until now.
Yeah, man. I mean, that's exactly what like I've been reflecting on from the stories in the book. And like, I guess my question is, so we're a church. I kind of shared this before we hit record, but with all the things going on politically, I feel like I'm kind of in a little maybe accelerated season of preparation for needing to respond. And, our church is active around housing and homelessness, and we have a lot of people that are involved in advocacy around those issues already, but it just feels like there may be time coming when we need to do some more engaging, kind of stuff that more collaborative with other churches, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. I guess like, how do you, it must take some creativity, but also some discernment to figure out like what to do. You know what I mean? Like how do you guys come up with the idea? Like, we're going to go to this detention center and have a Maundy Thursday foot washing service there. You know what I mean? Like how do you find your way into that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good, I think it's very much rooted in, like, for us, that event, it was very much rooted in our tradition. It was this, foot washing is super important for Mennonites. And so like, it just felt automatic in a way. And so, and as these deportations were kind of growing, things are horrible right now with Donald Trump as the president. It's really, really bad. at the time with Obama, it also felt pretty bad. He earned himself the name of like the deporter in chief. So it was just one of these things at the time. It's like, oh my gosh, they're taking our neighbors from us. This is wrong. What do we do? Like, what resources in our church's life, worship, in our tradition, and it just kind of happened. It just God, I guess, as we thought about it. I mean, similarly, I tell the story in the book about during the first Trump administration with Rosa del Carmen, who was no, she's documented now, but was an undocumented resident and needed a place to be protected, so she could be protected from ICE because she was flagged for deportation. And so our church welcomed her into sanctuary, protective sanctuary. So we, organized. This is a long history, a church history, where churches have been known to keep people safe when the law enforcement agents are after them for a period of time. And so we, tapped into that tradition and said, yeah, this is what we're going to do for Rosa. So we kept her safe at church for 2 years from ICE coming to get her. So, I mean, again, that's just an example of just like, oh, wow, there's this need. How has the church thought about this stuff in the past? Maybe there's something we can access now. So it's one of these things where it feels both spontaneous in terms of coming up with, the what to do. And at the same time, like it's the tradition. It's like we're not reinventing something. It's weird. It's both an old thing and it also feels spontaneous in terms of making the connection.
Yeah. It's interesting that like a 2-year work can seem spontaneous. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, you described like just providing safe harbor for her. And we've, like some of the new ICE directives, I don't even know what to call them, where they're saying like there's no longer sanctuary spaces, churches, schools. It's probably partly because of what you guys were doing, right? And it wasn't just you, but there was like a network of churches that were doing that sort of thing. And but like it sounds, again, it's like it's not just like a theater. Like you had to actually have someone there with her. She had to herself had to like stay there for a long. I mean, all of it's hard stuff to do. But when you're actually doing it, then there's like a witness there that's more than just like a silly tweet or something. It's like you know what I mean? Like there's like an embodied witness that's not.
We put our lives on the line. You know what I mean? It was one of these things where so at the time, I mean, it's one of these things where it's like you could get in trouble. I mean, we were all trained in, community defense, civil disobedience. What would happen if ICE showed up at the door to take her away? What would you feel comfortable doing? What a judicial warrant looks like as opposed to an administrative. All these things that I'd never thought of before became super significant for keeping her safe. We were ready to do it. But you're right. I mean, so it's spontaneous in terms of making the decision, but then we spent so much time figuring out what we need to do to make it happen. So I think we counted something like 160 volunteers from both our congregation, and it was in a partnership with we rented space from another church. And so we had to get them on board, a Presbyterian congregation. And so from their church, our church, and then churches in the community, people, and then, non-church people too would volunteer to help out. So like 160 volunteers from 11 congregations. And those were people signed up to do everything from bring groceries to do laundry. That was something it was so dumb. Like that first week, Rosa texted me. She was just like, so how do I do laundry? And I was like, oh my gosh. I didn't even, we were trying to think of everything, but we did not think about laundry. And so then we had to come up with like a laundry rotation of people, which is super personal. You know what I mean? Right. Like, I don't know. I'm one thing that I'm just totally just overwhelmed by is that Rosa just kind of entrusted herself to us. Like that was wild to me. And we delivered, you know what I mean? Like, we're a small church. It's not, I don't know. Just thinking back. I'm just super impressed. I mentioned early, I dedicate the book to Rosa and this other person who's in sanctuary, Samuel. And I mentioned early on that I say, I believe in the Holy Catholic Church or the Holy Apostolic Church, whatever you want to say in the old creeds. That's something that I say I believe in my head. But Rosa kind of believed it with her life. Like,
Right.
she's like, I'm entrusting my life to the care of the church. And that was a huge responsibility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, you have to have a certain understanding of what the church is in order to both trust it and in order to do what you guys did. Like it's, like so much of popular imagination about the church these days is it's just like you go to church and then you leave church, and like there really is this like strong sense of like we are the church, we are a community committed to one another long term, like with future plan, like you can depend on me, right? Like we'll be there, we're going to pick up the laundry later this week, and there's probably some volunteer who's like, yep, on Thursdays I'm going to be there to do the laundry, and even if I get in an argument with someone in the church, like I'll still be there next Thursday to do the laundry. And I mean that's like a different understanding of what we're doing when we are like a worshiping body of believers than is kind of common in the current era of like ecclesiology, right?
Yeah, that makes me think like that's a really good point about the way our congregation cultivated this disposition where it just made sense to do this. So, we're a church where when we celebrate communion, we also have a potluck meal. Like those two things come together. So it's like an ecclesiology where communion is tied to sharing stuff and eating together. And you do that enough times over the years, like every month or whatever it might be, you start to develop a sense of like, oh yeah, we are the church around tables as we share our lives and our food and pray and are involved in each other's lives and, Wednesday night groups or whatever it might be. So that, like you're saying, this cohesion that happens in the congregation is like, yeah, we can trust each other to do this to be there for each other. We've trusted each other to be there for each other in the past. Maybe we can do this for somebody else we don't know very well, like Rosa, who's living with us.
Yeah, man, it's beautiful. What
I'm highlighting all the beautiful parts about church, but it's a different book to talk about all the hard stuff as well.
Yeah, I feel like people do that with our church too. People from the outside are always like, "Oh, it's so beautiful what you guys are doing." You have all these people who are on the street that are in your congregation, and yeah, it's a lot messier than it looks from like an arm's length away, because it's just everybody has to mix, and it's
we mix, and we're messy people.
We all fall short, right? Yeah,
we all fall short.
Yeah. Well, what happens when it does? I guess I was going to ask about. I guess there's one of the things I was thinking about as I read the different stories, because I found myself wondering. You tell a story about ICE, and you talk about ICE having this reputation of like when their thing comes into the light, they kind of scatter, right? So you found them meeting up in a parking lot. They were probably going to go do a raid or something, and you felt like if you could kind of just confront them, just introduce yourself, say, are you a government agent? And then they probably scatter. And it seems like maybe they did, not really sure where they end up going. But what I found myself thinking is like, well, what happens? Because it feels like that may have been true 10 years ago, but I doubt that's as true today with like the empowerment from the Trump administration as it was then. You know what I mean? Do you feel like it changes the nature of the work of the church when the outside community is kind of openly hostile to that work? I mean, in some ways that was already the case with what you were doing, but you know what I mean? When it's just like, I feel like standing up to the Trump administration, like they don't care. It feels like, you know what I mean? So how does that change the discernment?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah. So yeah, what you're saying about ICE is true. So around here, we organized this ICE watching team so that we discuss. I mean, at the time, not just we, but like communities throughout the United States, networks combine people together, we share information, and notice that ICE was always like very reticent to be too public about their operations. because they're always operating on the edge of the law, which,
Mm.
the Trump administration is pushing that edge all the time. So they're always operating at the edge of the law. And so they realize it's always a risk of what they're doing. And they don't have any jurisdiction over citizens. That was the other thing about it. So ICE has no jurisdiction. They cannot touch, they can't touch citizens. We'll see what happens. So we found out that if you confront them and start asking them questions, they kind of just go away.
Yeah.
And so this is called like community defense work. And yeah, that was true back then, and it's turning out to be true now. It's so early to tell, but I've seen reports now of people confront. I think it was a Texas town recently, like last week, where they found that ICE was organizing in a parking lot. I can't remember, it was like a Target or Walmart parking lot every morning or evening, whatever it was, and then go out for their operations. Because the other thing about it is they don't have a station anywhere. You know what I mean? So like they show up for their operations in, Houston, let's say. I know Houston, they might have something, but Tulsa, Oklahoma. They don't have anywhere to go. They're just staying in hotels, motels, and then they have to all convene in the morning to go out. And so you find out where that is. And so these people showed up and just started recording them, and they got really like fussy about it and then left. And so it's just a way of disrupting their operations to make things more inconvenient. I think at this point, that's what a win is, sadly, is how do you disrupt the deportation machine? Because it's very hard to imagine dismantling it or changing it, but like, how do you make life difficult for people doing this work? I think is the question people are wrestling with.
Yeah. That's a helpful way to kind of frame some of the work, because again, like I don't know. I feel like maybe that's one of the things that seems kind of scary about the change in the posture of the Trump administration, even from like Trump administration part one, is that it's it felt like even when Trump first came on the scene, it just felt like there's no shame. You know what I mean? Like no one's going to pressure him to do it. He will say, I can shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and no one cares. And he kind of knows that. And now it feels even more so like he's just like, well, try to stop me. You can't, I don't care if you're going to protest away, who cares? And that it feels like, at least for a long time in American society, at least there's been an ability for civil rights movements of various sorts to put political pressure on people. And but like, I guess maybe that's one of the beautiful things about how you all have like done your work, or the work that's been happening in the book, is that it's not like the political pressure is not the only point. Like the point is to like do the right thing, to be the people you should be. I don't have like a question. Does it mind making sense?
That's right. I think it's like the fundamental question of like how we act in this world and whether or not our Christian witness is effective. It's so complicated to think through. Like you do the right thing because it's the right thing, and you want it to have an effect in the world. But I think it gets to the heart of the faith, which is the story of Jesus, where he gets killed. His ministry, and not just even before he gets crucified. It's kind of a ineffective ministry in some sense, because he gathers all these people around him, these disciples, and then they shrink. Like people start leaving him. There's like moments in the story where, he says, in John's gospel, for example, where he's like, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no part. And people, I can't remember exactly how it goes. And people like, whoa, this is a difficult teaching. And many left. So there's moments like that where you can see it shrinking. And then at the very end, like Judas betrays him, one of his beloved disciples who's been there the whole time, sells him out. Peter denies him, there in his moment of need. The disciple, when he's at in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he's feeling the weight of it all, and like he's like, please stay up with me, to his disciples, and they fall asleep, on him. So it just feels like step after step, it's not a revolution. He didn't start, you know what I mean? Like, this is not
Right.
a huge movement that's going to change the world. It shrinks and then he gets killed. I don't know. I think that means something for how we think about why we do the things we do and how we imagine they might be effective or change stuff. What
For
do you
sure.
think?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it sets you free from having to be effective, because
Mhm.
like you said, like I think the expectation on him, as like Messiah, the term Messiah is like liberator. Like many of them were very clearly expecting him to overthrow Roman occupation and rule, and he doesn't do that, right? Like
Yeah.
he doesn't. He gets crucified, and he's resurrected, and in like kind of a way that is, I don't know. This is like just typical gospel logic to me. Like Rome does kind of get overthrown by the faith as it spreads through Rome, but not in the way that anyone was expecting. It's like this.
Mhm.
It's this backwards way of overthrowing the most powerful empire in the region, for maybe in the region's history. I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, and so but I think that maybe that frees us up from like, we have to save the world,
Right.
to we have to be faithful and trust that the Spirit's going to work through the faithfulness of the people.
Yeah, no, that's
Um,
great. We don't have to save the world. This is uh, Karl Barth, that great Swiss theologian from the 20th century. He's just very clear. He's just like, no, the world already has a savior. His name is
right,
Jesus Christ.
right,
um, and that's not our job. And I mean, like you're saying, that is a bit liberating to think about. Yeah, we don't bear the world on our shoulders. There's somebody who it does, and we're just invited to bear witness to that love, to that care, and follow where it may. Yeah.
yeah,
But I also would like the world to change a little bit. So I don't
for
know what to
sure.
do about that.
Yeah, I know that's the rub, right? Because like, I mean, it's the same. It's like, I feel like you're describing the immigration system it's like a machine, right? You've kind of called it a machine a couple times. Overwhelming.
Mhm.
How do you stop like a juggernaut of a machine like that? And I
Yeah.
think homelessness for us feels very much like that. It's just like
Mhm.
it's so complex and it's so messy, and there's so many huge forces that, like a tiny church like ours, like we can put up 28 people on rainy nights, and that's pushing us to our limits. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
that's not gonna solve homelessness.
Mhm.
And it feels like, but like we so badly want it to be solved. You know what I mean? Like we want to
Yeah.
see people getting off the street. Um, and so in one way, it's kind of liberating to be like, okay, we don't have to be the ones who figure out homelessness and solve it with our meager resources and all that. But on the other hand, like, I do want to help solve it. You know what I mean? Um,
Mhm.
and we do want to be wise and strategic with like the time, resources, people, influence that we have
Mhm.
to like make a positive difference in the world. I don't know. How do you balance those
Well,
things?
so now you're making so yeah, I think part of it is maybe this is what I believe. I mean, I'm trying it out here. I'm trying to name what I think is like actually inside me. And
Yeah.
when it comes out in words, sometimes it makes sense or sometimes it doesn't. I don't know. We'll see. But I think what I believe is that I don't have a policy recommendation at this point. Like I don't know how to solve the immigration system issue. You know what I mean? I mean, I can come up with
Right.
like little policies. Like, I mean, yes, obviously we need to come up with like pathways to citizen. It's ridiculous that there are not ways to become citizens in this. It's ridiculous that there are residency permits. You know, all these things. It's just so. But at the same time, I'm just like, yeah, but borders, it's so complicated, and I guess what I find myself doing, and this is what led me to want to like write this book and share these stories, is I feel like I'm at the edge of knowing what to do and I can't go any further. And then I find these communities and people who are doing something, even though they don't know like a grand strategy, but they're
Mhm.
doing what they can. And that feels hopeful. And I hope that the more that I get involved in their work and watch what they're doing, that ideas might happen, that they
Yeah.
might inspire it might be creative moments to be like, you know what? We don't know about all that, but here's one thing we can do. So I don't know. So like there's this church in that I talk about in it's a Mennonite Latino Mennonite congregation, South Dallas, Texas. And they were just like, oh look, we need to just start having more meals and invite people to like be part of our congregation. And there's undocumented people, like they're in this plight with us. There's people in our congregation, people are our neighbors, so we just provide for them. And I'm like, yeah, right, like that's what you do, like of course, like this. Or there's the migrant shelter in Tijuana, Mexico, that's run by the Scalabrini priests, the Scalabrini order. And they're like, look, people are all through the Central America, South America, Central America, come up through, I mean, all over the world. I met people down there from person from Syria, person from Ethiopia. I mean, just everywhere. Oh, Ukraine. That's just how you try to get into the country when there's no way to get in. So all these people are just kind of bumping up against the wall down there in Tijuana, and these priests are like, look, they need food, they need shelter. Like we care about human beings and their plight. So at the very least, we can just give them a bed and make sure they have food and medical care or whatever it might be. And I hope that like those are the places where creativity might happen to inspire an imagination that we just couldn't come up with on our own. Does that make sense?
For
Like,
sure.
maybe another way to say it is I really believe that as we live out the life, that the gospel life, that through the practice of it, the Holy Spirit gives us new ideas. Like that's where creativity happens, is as we're doing the work.
Yeah, because you see the needs, you see new needs, and you make connections, and there's people in the work that have ideas about things to do that, maybe weren't empowered to do it before, but now that they're kind of getting involved in the community in some way. Yeah. And I think like maybe it inspires hope or creativity in like what we might do together, but also like, I think it helps us to fend off despair about the world too,
Yeah.
because I don't know. It's just especially these days, the world, it's so overwhelming that I feel like most of us can name like 6 ways that the world might completely be destroyed in the next 5 years. You know what I mean? And maybe that's an exaggeration, maybe not. I don't know. I have to think about it. But, like I think being like hearing these stories of people doing like actually good things that are like faithful and rooted in hope and rooted in like in the hope of Christ. Just hearing them is helps me at least to hold despair at bay. And I think participating in them is like an even deeper way to just be like, what, there's something good in this world. Like God is at work here. I'm gonna be a part of it, and I don't know how it's gonna end, but like I'm gonna be part of this good work at least.
Yeah. I mean, you're naming exactly what got me through or got me to write the book and put these stories together is like I go to these places and because I've heard about them, some through church networks or whatever it might be, and like a congregation or the migrant shelter or this guy Alvaro Enciso in Arizona who goes out and plants crosses wherever remains of migrants are found who crossed. And I go out because I'm looking for hope too, right? I mean, the despair is overwhelming, and I'm like, here are people doing things when there's nothing that I can imagine to do. And people find ways to go on doing at least something to get them through the week, through the month, through the years, that is pointing in a direction that's better than what we have. And yeah, people organizing their lives around hope. That's hopefully what I'm trying to describe. And just how beautiful it all is. Like it's just like people are amazing in their witness to another world happening in the midst of this one. And it's like, yeah, I can't help but want to share those stories with other people.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and like one of the things that I've written down is like to ask you is like and I feel like I'm kind of finding the answer to this and just in thinking and having a conversation, but like how does the personal spiritual practice meet up with like the communal work that we're talking about? You know what I mean? So I think this is like, I feel like for me, so much of my personal hope comes from the communal work. You know what I mean? That I sometimes, I'm not the strongest of like prayer practices are hard for me, put it that way. Like
Yeah.
I'm not great at spiritual discipline. It's really good for me when I get into them, but like it's not where I come to life in my spiritual life.
Hmm.
I come to life in seeing like the kind of works that we're talking about.
Hmm.
Where does that balance for you, or where do you see that in
Hmm.
as a pastor of community, former pastor of community that's doing this
Hmm.
stuff? Where do you see the balance between like those personal acts of like piety, faithfulness, prayer,
Hmm.
and like the larger communal work of justice and care for one another?
Yeah. Yeah. This is getting real now. I mean, um, I would say when I was a pastor, like it helped me, my faith life felt it was not complicated in terms of sorting things through because it's like every Sunday I have to say something about the gospel. And I have to read these Bible passages. And I mean, it's stressful. I mean, for me, because there's a lot like, I mean, the one thing that we're committed to as preachers is like sharing the gospel as good news and telling the truth. And that's a lot. And so, yeah, I mean, prayer becomes fundamental as part of all of that felt very natural to me as a rhythm and kept
Yeah.
me, um, yeah, centered, I guess. And then,
Sundays
like
come quick, right? Like they
Sundays
come
come
quick.
quick, right? And then during the week, like you're thinking about the people that you care and they're going to talk. You know what
Right.
I mean? So it's like
Yeah.
they're in your head too, and I don't know. That felt very grounding for me, the pastor's life. Yeah, and I would say that for prayer, there's this I found in oh yeah, actually in the I think I start the introduction of the book with prayers from this book that was put together by the Catholic Order. It's a prayer book for migrants. And when I was down in the migrant house, La Casa Migrante in Tijuana, I was able to get one of these prayer books, which has been just really helpful for me to think through my prayer life. And to think about all these people who are crossing the border and like really tough situations, praying these prayers. They're mostly like Psalms paraphrases for the most part, as and highlighted for people on the move. And I don't know, it helps me both think about their lives and also think about my own life and how much I depend on grace just to live, like other people's grace. And, it's not just somebody on the move that is dependent on
Right.
neighbors. I mean, like I am every day. And I need to recognize that as God's gift. And these prayers kind of help me remember that and to say, yeah, we're filled with gratitude for the ways that God is sustaining our lives. I don't know. So I mean, I'm kind of rambling around your question. Um, I think while I was a pastor, I felt my personal life. I never had to think about where my personal spiritual life and my church faith life and my political interest faith life, where one began and the other ended. It felt very cohesive.
Hmm.
Now I feel a little more disoriented, to be honest, about how it all fits together.
Yeah. Yeah, well, because like I mean, I really identified with that a lot. Like the rhythm of pastoral work kind of keeps you in it, right? There's like this in and out of like the study and the concern and just like the things that weigh on you as you try to love this group of people and feel responsible for them in some way.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah, I mean,
I
so for
think,
example,
yeah,
sorry, one example
no,
I was
good.
just thinking of the pastor's life and why it was so meaningful to me is like I don't really I only pray for myself when I'm like desperate for something, like when things have gotten really bad or there's a crisis or like health concerns or I'm in pain or whatever it might be. Then it's just like, oh my, I need help and I pray.
Yeah.
Um, I think being a pastor, what became automatic for me was like, during worship every Sunday, people would share their prayer requests.
Mhm.
And I would write them down. And I'm just like, yeah, what it means to be a pastor is like, I pray for people when they ask for prayer, like that's just
Right.
a fundamental. And so my prayers felt more oriented to the life of the community
Yeah.
as a regular rhythm. And as soon as, I would find that as soon as I start praying for somebody, it kind of it opens my eyes to like other people too. I'm just like, oh, wait a minute. That's not a unique thing to them. Obviously, other people, obviously, I wrestle with it. And so it just kind of prayer for one person produces prayer for more people for me at that point. And that felt good in ways where now my prayers are probably more just like self-centered.
Mm. Being out of that role. I mean, yeah, I forget who it was. I think it was a professor at Duke or somebody that just kind of offhand comment made a comment about like, well, yeah, if you say you're gonna pray for someone, you should pray for them. Like,
Yeah.
and I really took that to heart like a lot of years ago, and
Mhm.
now I'm like pretty careful about like what I commit to pray for. And like if I tell you I'm gonna pray for you, I will pray for you, at
Yeah.
least once. And I
Yeah.
don't tell people like I'm gonna pray for you every day because I probably won't most of the time,
Mhm.
but I'll
Yeah.
tell you like I'm gonna pray for you today, and then I will. Um, and I think like having some communal prayer practices have been really helpful for me for that. Like we have a kind of an open-ended sort of prayer liturgy where we pray for a lot of different categories of people who are sick and people who are, unhoused and people who are struggling with addiction. And it's kind of a prompting to like think of all the people that you've talked to this week that you need to pray for. And I think it functions that way. And like following through on yeah, that in a spiritual discipline in and of itself is like when you say you're going to pray for someone or something, like do it. And
Yeah.
it seems simple, but like it's actually pretty profound,
Yeah. I
Yeah,
know it is. And it opens us up to like what God's up to too, which I think is important.
yeah,
Yeah. I don't know. I keep on going with this prayer, with this pastor prayer life. That's important. Yeah,
yeah. It's good
that's where
stuff.
it's at.
Yeah. Um, yeah. Well, what's next? What are you working on now? Like how are you thinking about all of the things, as people say? And
Mhm.
I know you're working on your PhD and stuff, but like in terms of, I mean, maybe in terms of that, or maybe in terms of like kind of, in engagement with issues of like justice and faith, like
Mhm.
what are you working on?
Well, the thing that came to my every once in a while, this line comes to my mind when things feel really bad in this country. It's the sermon title from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s final sermon, which he was not able to preach because he was assassinated. Do you know this? Do you know the sermon title? Do
No.
you know? I know. So I learned this from uh, Richard Lisher. Did you have Richard Lisher? Was he
Yeah.
at Duke? Yeah,
Yeah.
just a super wonderful human being.
Yes.
Anyhow, I remember this from one of his classes or whatever, maybe his book. I can't remember. But so yeah, so the Thursday that um, that Thursday that Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, before a few hours before that, he called the church secretary because he's going to be home on Sunday. He's a preacher. Like this is what Richard Lisher highlights in his book about King is that he's a preacher. Like we just can't
Right.
forget that he was fundamentally that's his rhythm of life. He always
Mhm.
thinks about the next sermon. So on Thursday, as a good preacher, he calls the church secretary and says, "Hey, I got my sermon title for I don't know, the worship bulletin or the kiosk. I can't remember. I don't know what but you have to come up with a sermon title." And his sermon title was "Why America May Go to Hell."
Mm.
And it's just, and yeah. So I think about that sermon title, the sermon that he never was able to preach, and what he was thinking, like what was going on where it felt that bad, like the world felt that bad for him. And yeah, so I returned to that. I just finished writing something, just thinking through like what are the options, and I kind of revisited his story and what was going on the last 2 years of his life. Richard Lisher in his book, I can't remember the name of it, and I feel very badly about this right now. But in his The Preacher King, that's what it's called. It's called The Preacher King. It's a
That's
great
right.
book.
Yeah.
But what Lisher like listens to all the archives of all the sermons and speeches that King's giving in, like anywhere in the country. He gets access and he listens, try to figure out what's going on. And the thing that he highlights within King's last 2 years of his life, I mean, he obviously King did not know they were the last 2 years of life, but his tone shifts. Lisher says his tone shifts from kind of progressive liberalism to liberationism, from reform to revolution, because he's working so hard for this movement of civil rights, and he's getting abandoned over and over again in mass by the white church. King thought that the ties in the church that made us brothers and sisters in Christ would transcend the race line. He really believed that. And so when his white pastors of these churches kind of like abandoned him, that was devastating to his spirit. Like, it was just like, oh my gosh, like, I can't believe. And then the other thing was he preached, I think it's 1965. He preaches his Beyond Vietnam speech where he says the Vietnam War is unjust and it is racist. And he kind of calls everybody out on it. And then at that moment, he loses a lot of political leverage in the civil rights movement that he had developed for so long. Because people are like, whoa, wait a minute. This is about civil rights here at home. It's not about the militarism over there. And so he gets, very worried about the direction of the country and what he says, the soul of the country. And so, I get worried. I think about that. Like, what's going on here where this world feels pretty bad? And what does it mean to live in the midst of just egregious sin and cruelty, like structures of cruelty that just kind of grow exponentially every week, and we're destroying ourselves, and this feels bad. So that's what I've been thinking about right now. And I mean, through it all, even though he's like, that's the title of his sermon, he had some other sermons before that, Lisher notes, or speeches where he would say things like, America's under judgment now, or something like that. But it never distracted him from the work. It was like part of it. So it's not like despair. It's like incentive for him to double down on organizing. So in the midst of that, he's organizing the Poor People's Campaign, which is this march where he's getting, an interracial march of basically people who are poor to demand like more egalitarian sharing of economic resources. So he's organizing and he's making stuff happen, and at the same time thinking like, oh wow, things are bad and getting worse. I don't know. So I feel like that's where I am these days.
Yeah.
That was maybe too long of an answer for your question.
No, it was great. And I think, honestly, like, kind of like we were saying, I think that like reading the stories that you highlight in the book and others like it, like that's where I kind of personally find my hope. And those are the things that help me to fend off despair, that and the preaching rhythm, I think, like you said. Hopefully, my hope and prayer is that our church, will be a part of that for ourselves and for others in our neighborhood and beyond. If we can continue to commit ourselves to faithfulness and to the hard work of like caring for one another, which is very hard, probably in all contexts. It feels especially hard in the context of homelessness. But I think it's probably hard no matter, what your kind of demographics are. Then somehow out of the mess, like will come like some hope, and we'll stick with it and hang in there. So, yeah.
And I mean, I don't want this to be a trite thing, but like, as you're talking about, we're like kind of stuck in the mess and that's where we're living. I mean, I believe Jesus was resurrected from the dead. I mean, if there's anything
right.
that feels completely impossible and should like blow our minds about what can happen, it's like Jesus was resurrected from the dead. That all bets are off now, I guess.
Yeah.
What could happen?
Right. Well, like if you hang around in the places that the Spirit is working, or if you if you're around Jesus enough, like you're going to see some cool stuff. You know what I mean? Like you're going to see some things that blow your mind, and that it might not be every day. Like some days might just be dealing with petty drama between people who are arguing over silly things, or, narcanning someone on the ramp in front of the church, or, like it might just be that kind of stuff. But if you hang around long enough,
nothing petty about narcanning somebody else. Just a pause right there.
Well, okay, yeah, that's a big one. I was just thinking of examples of things that I've done recently that I was like, man, I really need to be doing something else right now. Which, I mean, like, yeah, giving someone Narcan is what you need to be doing, but like, you know what I mean? Like I guess Narcan is kind of a miraculous experience of seeing someone like who's like literally like looks like they're dying, and then all of a sudden they're just, he was up and turned down medical treatment and rode off on his bike. Dude, you gotta go to the hospital. You're gonna OD again as soon as it wears off. Anyway, that's another story for another time. but I guess what I'm trying to say is like, not every moment is gonna be that, but like if you're around the Spirit, like you're gonna see cool stuff, and like you're gonna see resurrection, maybe in literal way, maybe in like in more social ways, or I don't know, but you got to be around. You got to stick around and stick it out long enough to kind of see the beauty of it, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, I've kept you a long time. Do you have any closing thoughts or anything you want to share on the way out?
No, just thank you for taking time to read the book and for talking to me about it and letting me ramble here. Yeah, this has been great. Thanks so much, Chris.
For sure. No, and I recommend everybody read it. It like I said, I read it in a few days. It's short, not in a bad way. Like it's short in a really nice way. Like it's really nice to read. It's inspiring and hopeful. And just in case someone forgot what it's called, Migrant God, A Christian Vision for Immigrant Justice. And this is Isaac Villegas. Thank you so much for coming on. And thank you for your friendship over the years and just for all of it.
Yeah, thank you.